Our webinar today is about bringing together the IT and OT cybersecurity really realms and answering the question, are IT and OT cybersecurity two sides of the same coin? And we thought what better way to do that than bring a member from our IT team and our OT team together and share the presentation. So I will be joined on this webinar by my colleague, RJ Michalsky, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And there's my background and picture. Unfortunately, you have the chance to look at the picture there. Background, math, computer science. So I tend to be that IT person, been working across a number of different industries for a bunch of years, systems engineering, and really across the entire life cycle. So I've got some perspectives there on how to build into IT systems. And then over the last few years now, going into the IACS certifications for cybersecurity, how to protect those systems. And one of the things you learn with the CISSP is the different domains that are out there, which is very relevant when you're trying to look at security controls. And so I'll take that IT perspective, as Patrick mentioned, and provide that for you. And Patrick's next for his intro.
Yep, and so I come at it a little bit more from the operations technology side of things. So my background is in chemical engineering, and I've been working for the last couple of years with Exida as a safety and cybersecurity engineer. So really being kind of at that cornerstone of where functional safety and cybersecurity relate, and understanding then how to apply that. And so together with RJ, we hope to give a good combination of both the IT and OT perspectives. And that's really keeping in line with the overall goal of Exida. We try to help our customers achieve safe, secure, and reliable solutions. And we do that by bringing kind of different industry segments and different parts together. And so to do that, we have three main areas of business. The first is our enterprise tools. So our Excellentia tool that can be used for functional safety lifecycle tasks, as well as for cybersecurity lifecycle tasks. Then we also have our certification activities, so providing both functional safety certification to 61508, as well as cybersecurity certification to IEC 62443. And then lastly, we have lifecycle services. So really helping with functional safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management at each step of the lifecycle. And so by having those three areas together, we feel that we're able to really have an overall understanding of the industry and really help customers in a variety of situations. In addition, we really are a global company. So each Exida icon you see on the map represents a different office. And we work across pretty much every different industry. So, whatever the problem is, if it relates to functional safety or reliable automation or cybersecurity, we're really, the people who would like to help. And so with a little bit more about how specifically we can interact with cybersecurity, I'm going to hand the slide off to RJ.
Alrighty, so what we're really focused on, cybersecurity consulting, drawing on the background of a lot of our engineers, and then also our focus from the safety and the certification side, what industry standards are out there, and we'll talk about that in a couple seconds here. But the idea is to look at those standards, use those as frameworks, and so this idea of pragmatic cybersecurity, that we've got consulting services that would relate and look at gaps, for instance, in your environment, and then relate that to what the best practices should be in trying to come up with some prioritization of objects that you could work on, projects you can work on to improve your cybersecurity posture. So we have a number of services. Assessments will do gap assessments, vulnerability assessments, certification of different products, devices that are out there. And then training classes similar to the webinar here, where we actually would either go out or do a public class. We've done things on different customer sites around the world in terms of the different curriculum that has to do with, again, best practices from a cybersecurity standpoint. And then there's some reference materials, and there is a book that has been written, Patrick, one of the co-authors there, on the pragmatic focus, which is, again, going back to the standard and saying how you would be able to implement that and trying to draw from the sort of theoretical framework of a standard into something that would be pragmatic and practical for customers to use. And so that's some of our focus there. And the next slide. There you go.
Yep. So then specifically in this webinar, what we'll be looking at is really that IT-OT team relationship. And so we'll start by talking about, what are the differences between the IT and OT team, try to get an understanding of where their experience and what their priorities, how they may differ. Next, we'll look at what the strategies and best practices are for actually aligning the IT and OT cybersecurity efforts. So making sure that they are working together. And then lastly, we'll look at really how to get benefits from coordinating the IT and OT teams working together. That way, so first we'll kind of look at the differences and maybe the potential issues with the communication. We'll look at the best practices to fix that, and then we'll finish with really how to get benefits from that. And so to do that, first we'll look at the differences between IT and OT, and I'll let RJ go through it and look at the IT side of this standard.
Sure. So one of the things we like to do, being a certification body, is to understand that there are multitudes of standards out there, and one of the ones that comes up pretty often within the IT domain is this one from ISO, a 27000 series, focused really on information systems and the security management of them. So it really goes across the life cycle. How do you establish these kind of systems, implementation, operations focus, the maintenance, and then this continual improvement. So the actual specs themselves, 27001 and then 27002, first one, 01, focuses really on requirements, sort of a business focus, what the risks would be, the design of different management systems that you would have, how to manage the information, the data that you've got within your organization, your enterprise, and then the implementation of security controls. Security controls being something that would allow you to put a technical or a process control against different topics that would allow you to build an infrastructure that would be more secure. The other thing it focuses a lot on is organization of the company, the enterprise, leadership, the planning, the support, how to put something together to be able to have an operations focus that would be secure, and then this improvement feedback loop within there. 27002, on the other hand, is more focused on some of those security controls, the best practices, starting off with what would information security policies be, some information, some data that should be in there, the organization, the sections, and so forth. And then a lot of the specifics of information security itself, from organization of companies and the groups, HR, the human relations aspects, and then some of the technical controls with the assets, the management, the controls, the cryptography, and so forth. The operational physical security, all of these practices together are what allows an organization to operate, maintain security in the face of all these emerging threats that are out there. So between these, our role really is to try to understand what's here, again, a framework, not that these are requirements that you have to explicitly follow, but a lot of good ideas and standards in here that will get translated into security policies organizations can build and follow then for themselves. And next, we have IEC.
And so from the OT side, really the standard that we're talking about for cybersecurity is the IEC 62443 standard. And this also really focuses in on that life cycle approach, understanding how during the assessment phase where you're going through the initial design, how to identify potential security risks and then design mitigation and countermeasures to try to protect against those. For the implementation phase, then really applying those countermeasures, validating to make sure that the appropriate protection is achieved, and then going through and actually constructing and verifying that the built plant meets this. And the goal then during this assessment and implementation phase is to make sure that once you're up and running, once you're in that maintenance phase, that you've designed a system that can be maintained and really kept secure from the variety of cybersecurity threats. So that just kind of gives a brief overview of what the IT and OT standards are. Now we'll look a little bit more, and RJ will look at kind of how their priorities can differ and what the keys there are.
All right. One of the things that you learn pretty early in a cyber career is that the CIA concept here, which is not the government organization, this stands for some basic cybersecurity principles: the confidentiality of information, maintaining integrity of information, and then availability. So confidentiality, protecting your data, your intellectual property of an organization from disclosure to non-authorized people, individuals, governments, nation states, whichever, tends to be the primary focus of IT. So the idea being, now I want to enable the work staff to be able to do what they need to do and maintain the confidentiality of that data. Whereas on the OT side, really it's about availability. You're typically working within some sort of process standard, something being built, manufactured, produced, and you wouldn't want your IT systems to get in the way of that. So the availability being the prime focus, and these differing priorities here leads to different requirements, different tools, a different approach in terms of how you manage and maintain secure operations within them. So this is an important thing to, I guess, start and understand as kind of the backdrop for a lot of the things we'll continue to talk about here. And so for the next slide, brings in some more specifics here in terms of some of the differences IT/OT, and really what IT having to focus on the external perspectives. That's where your internet facing sites would be, your users would be out there. There's a lot of applications. They could be running web applications, just so you have web servers out there, the operating systems and so forth. So the technology lifecycle and the refresh rate there tends to be rather fast compared to OT, where you'd be building those systems, trying to do perimeter defenses and trying to get the critical assets sort of locked away, segmented away, if you will, much harder to penetrate from an outside perspective, and only allowing those authorized individuals within the certain segments to be able to operate and access those systems. So the other thing too that comes up is a lot of times from an IT perspective, having to be aware of evolving threats and vulnerabilities of the systems to those threats. IT would often conduct testing exercises, either like a pen testing exercise or some phishing exercises, to try to train people, make them aware of what cyber threats are emerging, what they see out there with ransomware, with malware, and what that could actually do to systems. So a lot of the awareness there tends to be focused on preventing those things and trying to raise the awareness of all the folks across the individuals and across the corporation there. Some of the other thing there on the bottom, the frequency of events. I mean, when you're looking at internet-facing sites, what often happens is all of your IP addresses are constantly getting scanned. People outside applications are looking for places, vulnerabilities, weaknesses to be able to penetrate, to be able to do something, injecting of some sort of malicious content, some software that might beacon back out through some command and control servers. So the volume of threats that IT has to deal with leads to a lot of focus on automation, trying to process a lot of the threats and a lot of those transactions in an automated fashion, and then just alert out to cyber analysts what something that should be paid more attention to, if you will. Whereas the kind of contrasting on the OT side, trying to have the really exclusions. So I don't want those outside individuals to be able to actually even get access to those systems or see the IP addresses of any kind of internal networks. They should be completely segmented away. So on the next slide, just sort of a graphical representation then in terms of segmenting and doing different zones. The enterprise zone meant to be that anyone in your organization looking out, these would be your classic users doing internet searches, running applications that would be across the web, allowing your users to be able to access forms and data. All those servers and all the infrastructure has to be able to support those external people. So you have to have IP addressable devices. They have to be able to be found and then looking out from there. The DMZ being the part then, that demilitarized zone, is trying to segment the network, that enterprise zone for those individuals that have to do that, separating them from what the manufacturing or the areas would be that would be on the OT side, which is where Patrick can pick it up from.
Right. And so really looking at where the trade-off between the IT scope and the OT scope is important and can change from site to site. So when it comes to really the manufacturing zone and the cell area zone, those kind of lower levels in our model, that's where, we definitely have our OT scope. So looking at engineering workstations, the operator interfaces, really the communication with our control system. And then the OT firewall between the DMZ and this manufacturing network sometimes falls in the scope of the OT team. Sometimes they have everything below this firewall. I've seen OT teams that actually have their own demilitarized zone and a number of firewalls within the IT just having the enterprise network. So really understanding what the approach to setting up the scope between the IT and OT teams is really important for understanding what the firewall rule sets are, making sure that there's no straight pathway through a demilitarized zone, and really making sure that that network segmentation is maintained. And so that kind of gives a quick overview of the the different scopes. In terms of the differing organizational structure, I'll hand that one back over to RJ.
All right, so organizations then usually are going to be structured to facilitate from, let's say, an OT perspective, the production of some material, some process there. So the structure in the organization that typically gets put in place is more localized. So plant manager would have individuals reporting to them there, including the OT personnel that would be responsible for cyber protections. Typically, though, these folks are focused on operations. That's what the plant is there for, to produce, let's say, whatever kind of materials it's intended to. So as a support of that, often you have process engineers, and the skill set being more chemical focused or mechanical focused, process focused, if you will, and often the folks not having that IT background because they haven't been brought into the environment with a focus on trying to protect the entire enterprise, if you will. Whereas the IT team tends to be some corporate headquarters location, typically maybe where a CIO or a CISO would be located. So you have a chief information officer, a chief information security officer. And the nice thing there would be that one single person that would have responsibility trying to adjudicate across any issues that comes up. But whereas you might have plant teams very focused in different geographies, the IT team might have to be spread across multiple sites. They may be working out of a corporate headquarters or have representatives in different locations, but their focus, as we've mentioned, is external on that enterprise and then focused on internet-facing systems, which have a different threat profile, if you will, than the OT systems that would be internal. And often different in terms of whether they're outsourced or whether you have contractor support or whether you have internal people. And we've seen all sorts of different models there, but that's just some background as to some of the differences there in terms of what the org structure looks like. And next slide.
And so when we get back to kind of addressing that question of, are IT and OT two sides of the same coin, it's probably good to take a step back and really look at what the meaning of this expression is. So kind of the first step to decoding it is that this really is an idiom. And so focusing on kind of the second definition, it's an expression in the usage of a language having a meaning that cannot be derived from the conjoined meanings of its elements. So if we think about just what each word in two sides of the same coin means, we don't really get the full expression. But when we think about how people typically use it, it's if two things are two sides of the same coin, they're very closely related, although they seem different. And so I got that one from the Cambridge Dictionary. So you can, if you don't take my word for it, that's kind of really what that expression is supposed to mean. And so when we think about it from an IT and OT perspective, we can really focus on, maybe what the apparent differences are, and also then what the close relationship is and why they're so closely tied. And so we've looked at the differing standards from IEC 62443 to ISO 27001 and 2. We've looked at kind of these at-odd priorities where OT side is all about availability, where IT is really focused on confidentiality, the different technical experience, as well as a different organizational structure from the OT team being mostly located at a specific site under a plant manager, and then typically seeing that corporate IT team. And so it's important to understand that there are those differences in place between the IT and OT teams, but despite that, there really is that close relationship. And that all comes down to achieving the same business objectives. So really making sure that those sites are protected against cybersecurity threats, making sure that there's a coordinated approach for really managing the cybersecurity risk for that organization, for that profile, and understanding, what decisions are being made, what the network segmentation strategy is, and really what is done to just isolate the control network as well as allow the necessary access through. And so really to ensure that safe and secure operation, having that close relationship between the IT and OT teams is really an essential part of that. And so for the next portion of our webinar, we'll look at some of the best practices and different strategies that can be used to try to effectively align the IT and OT cybersecurity efforts. So to start, we'll just look at kind of a couple broad elements for effective processes. And so when we think about doing something effectively, there are a couple key points. The first is to make sure that any task you do, you only have to do once, and that it's done correctly the first time. And so if we think about maybe a task such as defining the firewall rules for the OT firewall, understanding who has ownership of that firewall, understanding what communication needs to go through, and then being able to coordinate that between the IT and OT teams is really essential for making sure that that is done once and done correctly. And kind of part of getting tasks done correctly is making sure they're going to the right people. So being able to delegate the task to the appropriate resources, having proper communication and communication channels so that if the OT team responsible for putting those rules together have questions, that they can then go to the IT team and be able to have that clear communication to effectively complete the task. And really putting a structure in place. So actually building those communication channels, developing the processes and procedures so that there is really a clear pathway through can be really important to having an effective, coordination effort of the IT OT teams. Having, proper places for storage, so having where the IT documents and maybe all of the instances that they're tracking are located, as well as the OT forms is important. So that way also there can be kind of an easier identification of what information is available to each group. And then when it comes to, looking at upgrades and understanding if there's an upgrade to the control system, if there's an upgrade to the enterprise network, really understanding the impact that that project is going to have and being able to coordinate that between the IT and OT personnel. And then the last item of building the right team, when we think about cybersecurity, IT and OT are two just fundamental parts of that team. So being able to make sure that they're working together and working effectively then is really important. When we talk about what makes an effective team, I like to point out that the sources going into this are some actual organizational psychology papers. My one good friend from school is actually getting his PhD in organizational psychology, so he's a very good reference to rely on when I'm trying to talk about things such as really how to effectively organize different teams. And he does come up with gems every once in a while, like the influence of demographic heterogeneity on the emergence of consequence of cooperative norms in work teams. So, a very deep technical knowledge, and I tried to then take it back and bring it back to the 1,000-foot view. And I found that this can be a really helpful way in understanding how to put groups together. So when we talk about effective teams, there are a couple of things that, effective teams have in common. So at the top, having clear leadership, coordination, and communication are essential for having people work together. Kind of as we said before, having the right people on the team. So that combination of the technical expertise, whether it's from the IT or OT background, and then the communication skills to be able to kind of share that knowledge and reach that common understanding. Having the clear motivation, so understanding really what the objective of the team is, having well-defined roles and responsibilities so each member knows the tasks that they need to perform and understands how they interact with others on the team, and then really working on an integrated approach to minimize conflict. And so on the next slide, what we'll look at are kind of the overarching types of conflicts that are found in teams. And so there are really four fundamental types. The first is relational, and so that's a conflict based on an incompatible identity or ideology. So if we think about the priorities, a potential relational conflict might be that the OT personnel have availability as really the main priority in their perspective, whereas IT is thinking about confidentiality. So that's kind of a fundamental disagreement in really what's valued for those two different groups. It could be a potential source of conflict. When we look at status, this is kind of conflict that arises based on the hierarchical position of others, or trying to kind of establish that you're differentiated from other personnel. And so based off of the organizational structure of having IT as a corporate entity and the OT plant-based, there's kind of a potential to almost build in that status conflict. And so working to get that coordinated team and minimize that conflict can be a really important step. Next, a process conflict is disagreeing on, how a task is done, who should be responsible for what. So having that organization and that clear delineation of the scope can be helpful in avoiding those types of conflict. And then task conflict is kind of the odd man out. Because while the first three types of conflict are really things that hinder the effectiveness of a team, a task conflict, so specifically a disagreement on the content or the outcome of the task being performed, can actually be beneficial and improve the overall quality of work. And so the idea here is that understanding the different aspects that the team members are bringing together, their varied experiences, you can work through maybe some different perspectives of how the task should be completed and what the final result should be, and try to then leverage all of that experience. And so that's really where the benefit from having those IT and OT personnel together can be seen. So that kind of goes through, the 1,000-foot view of some general ideas for trying to have effective teams and effective organization structure. Now I'm going to hand it over to RJ to really look specifically at what can be done for IT and OT teams.
So given that type of structure there and understanding what the conflicts are that could be in teams, how can you possibly resolve those conflicts? As we said, there's going to be task differences right out of the gate with IT and OT, and you're not going to be able to resolve those. But something that could be done, and some things that we've seen as consultants that seems to be pretty effective, is training. We've had a number of customers we've worked with, one in particular that was an international company, had a lot of software developers spread around the globe, and we did a training class for them about how to build secure software. And it was fascinating that a lot of times this is the first time these people have actually met. They hadn't ever been doing anything maybe more than an email. So this is the first time they had gotten together in person. And the nice thing from that was it provides a nice context for what the organization was and what their backgrounds were, creating from some shared experiences for them. So they were learning about methods to use for building of secure software, how to do different testing methods, and some of the best practices there. So in the training, what it led to was, as on the other side there, some communication aspects. So the personnel building peer relationships, building trust, because now they had actually met each other. Different countries, different geographies had different aspects in terms of what their technical backgrounds were. But in a class like that, communications was able to go across the different objectives of the different groups and then go back to, in this case, the security policy that they were to enable, and looking at the overall organization and how they were to produce software that would ended up being embedded in different devices there. So bringing these disparate groups, if you will, together under a common training banner like that, we found to be very effective in terms of actually breaking down some of the barriers and then allowing them to put a name with a face and then go forward and understand who in the organization was someone that they could trust to be able to ask questions and then share information with, so they wouldn't have an adversarial type relationship. Instead, they would have more of a data sharing type relationship. And then the next slide, when you talk about, well, how do I structure my organization? As we mentioned, about 27001 as some best practices type things, but there's really only two primary ways to do this in terms of the actual organization of an enterprise. The first one here is this cross-functional team. So if I have one team that's responsible for both IT and OT assets and those devices and the communications and the network engineering and everything that would go along with that, that would be one way to do that. So in this case, you would have a senior manager of some sort responsible for cybersecurity, and they would have individuals that might go across the operations, the engineering staff, certainly the IT staff. And so this would allow clear direction to be set, and certainly also asset ownership as to who owns what and then who's to address the different security issues. So one approach, cross-functional team, and then the next slide, a separate team. And you know, which is the best? Hard to say. We've seen both be done effectively. In this case, you'd have a separate team. So I'd have an IT team separated from OT team that would have, let's say, different requirements, different needs. The challenge here is having the leadership that would be able to bridge and promote those communications that we just talked about, and making sure that the team understands that there may be conflicting goals there, back to that confidentiality versus availability, but at the end of the day, it's still the enterprise, the corporation, the company, and the organization here is to protect all of the organization and all of the data it has and produces. So both of those practices could be effective, two different ways of approaching how you'd organize your cybersecurity staff. And the next slide then talks really about the policy. This is a good place to start. We talked about the standards and understanding what those are, but the security policy for an organization would then take that and allow the organizational policy to be put into something that would be more specific based on the marketplace you're in, the devices. Are you producing hardware? Are you producing embedded software? How are you going to do operations and maintenance of that? The need and the importance of having cybersecurity principles can be put right into the policy, and then the roles and responsibilities of the different groups can be levied right in there. So depending on whether you've got that cross-functional team or not, you can still define the roles here that would allow the organization to effectively operate and provide those cyber protection mechanisms. And that should go all the way down from the senior management, those that have to make business decisions, all the way into the operations and engineering and technical personnel that might be making process decisions or decisions on more of a local level as opposed to decisions that would impact the entire operation. All right, and then the next slide. Start looking at some of the benefits here of having this kind of coordination now. And one of the first benefits we've talked about already is this sharing of data. So if you've got your organization, whether it's the cross-functional team or the separate teams, sharing of information though across that IT/OT boundaries can be so beneficial. Starting back again with that security policy and then understanding how that could be implemented. What we've seen a lot of mature organizations have is then something that would relate to the incident response process. So in the policy, or maybe a separate policy, would be how do we respond to incidents? What should we do? Whose role and responsibility when something does go wrong? The idea here is to think of these things through ahead of time, as opposed to in the heat of the moment if something happens and there's a breach or there's some issue with something to do with your system or plant or process. The idea here, having a ability to capture an incident, track it start to finish, and be able to do forensic analysis. So over time, as you understand vulnerabilities are changing out there, you're able to respond to them on a continual basis. And this data sharing then also extends, as Patrick had mentioned, about firewall rules and monitoring. If I have multiple plants in different locations, they may be able to benefit or reuse firewall rules so that you wouldn't have to have that IT expertise, particularly in network engineering, replicated all the way across your corporation. You might be able to do it from some centralized point and then just have the understanding of the changes of the rule sets depending on the actual infrastructure, depending on how those IT systems are architected across the different geographies and different plants. And there may be other aspects that has to do with patches and patch management. IT and OT have a fundamental disagreement there because IT would just often say, we'll just reboot the server, new patches installed, life goes on. But OT, having long-running processes, may not be able to take something down. So the scheduling of patches within a maintenance window can become important, and making sure that those things are done during certain time windows when you're able to maybe take a plant offline. And also having security operations centers, network operations centers, sharing information on what they see as incidents or what they see as new vulnerabilities is a good benefit across the company there. And the next slide, talking through a little different perspectives, the organization and technical sharing of the data, but also sharing of knowledge, and then also the supply chain, understanding that different parts of your organization might have to be involved. As IT equipment or other plant equipment is purchased, can you say that the supply chain all the way back to the original manufacturer has been secured? Do you know that from a hardware standpoint of components put together, maybe from circuit logic boards, and also from a software perspective? These days with open source libraries and reusing of different applications that are open source, can you ensure your ultimate application has been built on secure software components that you know and can manage as you've been able to integrate them into your final operation? And also, as we mentioned, the sharing of things, firewall, patch management, network upgrades, those things that often are done most efficiently from a corporate enterprise perspective. You may have purchase discounts there. You may want to have some commonality of your IT equipment because you might be able to get lower prices on not only the equipment themselves, but also the maintenance. The maintenance that going across a consistent vendor set, a consistent usage and consistent tools might allow you to drive your costs down there. So there's some different structures you can put in place. And the next slide.
And I think kind of one key area really to talk about then is also coordinating that network segmentation. So understanding, the ownership of each firewall, being able to clearly communicate what the rules for the IT firewalls are, and aligning that with the OT firewalls to make sure that you do have that coordinated network segmentation. And one point that was brought up in the morning session of the webinar was, how do you think the industrial Internet of Things is going to influence the IT-OT relationship? And really, the answer is it's going to only make it more critical because as this manufacturing and industrial control system becomes more connected, being able to properly segment it from the enterprise network is going to become more and more important. So having that understanding of what the boundary devices are and what protection they provide is only going to continue to get more important. And it's really fundamental to that idea of having that defense in depth approach for cybersecurity. So not only having clear communication when it comes to the supply chain, so addressing potential security concerns in the software and hardware purchase, both by IT and OT, understanding the rules for the IT perimeter firewall, and making sure then that's coordinated with your OT perimeter firewall so that you have really two independent layers of protection, but there's no common cause failure that can kind of go through and overcome both of those firewalls. And that's really kind of one of the key places for establishing network segmentation. Also coordinating patch management between teams. So being able to have that discussion of really what the criticality of the patch is, how severe of a vulnerability it is, and then being able to make the decision either to download that patch now or to be able to have that justification on a risk basis for waiting for the next outage. So really having clear communication and addressing those things help to put different layers of protection in place. Understanding what the different devices on the network are, being able to scan not only to see what's connected, but to determine what applications and potential vulnerabilities are in each device. There's a lot of room for coordination there between the IT and OT teams to improve the overall efficiency of the process and make sure that kind of the most important areas are being looked at. And then also kind of that idea of the continuous monitoring. So whether it's monitoring firewall traffic to identify are there a certain number of access denies, or really just trying to understand what's currently going on is another great place where, IT has a skill set that OT could leverage, and then improving that communication and overall understanding provides a lot of metrics that can provide really useful information when it comes to cybersecurity. So to talk a little bit more about metrics, I'll hand it back over to RJ.
Alrighty, thank you. And metrics are those great mechanisms to use to provide that communication from the IT and OT perspectives. The metrics can support the security policy. They can be things that would be breaking the policies up into more specific instances. For instance, maybe the scanning. So I'm looking across my network for vulnerabilities. I want to make sure that I understand the inventory, what devices are out there, and as I add new devices or devices change or there's new firmware updates, that I have an accurate inventory so that when I'm assessing what am I vulnerable to, I can really do a nice job with that. And then mitigation policy in terms of how I would want to patch, the frequency, the updates there, what is the risk if I do not have a current system patched. And auditing, there may be certain things that are done in terms of the frequency. You may have regulatory impacts that you have to audit and scan your systems within a certain frequency. And the incident management, making sure that I've got reporting and the resolution. So numbers, metrics, data on all these things can allow the IT and OT organizations to report up to corporate management that we are following. Here's what we've got in terms of the quantities of these different things. And another aspect to keep in mind with metrics is who is the consumer. So if I'm talking about a user or an IT/OT engineer, I'd have a very different type of perspective than maybe a decision maker that just needs to see a summary. Metrics can also be used for compliance, thresholding, in terms of, do I have to consider this or not? Is this alert something that should be paid attention to, or does it actually cross some threshold, in which case then it might be an actual alarm, which would indicate that there has to be some personnel action to take. And frequency and where these things are going and where they're collected from. These days, it's great to have the sensors and the instrumentation to get data from all remote plants, maybe aggregated together, so headquarters can take a look and see firewall rules, get some insights on IP address denials and different things. Over time, the organization here, what we've seen is can get more mature based on what information it's got, what information is beneficial to it, so that, for instance, at the local level, those plant managers there are getting the information they need, but then also the information gets reported out and up to the enterprise. So across the corporation, they could see how well, and if there's any particular plants that seem to be now more exposed based on some emerging cyber threats. So that's some more details on the metrics aspect. And the next slide here, incident response. Hopefully you do not have a plan like our good buddy Dilbert here. Yelling help might be a first stage, but hopefully not your final stage for what your plan looks like. The idea with this, well, again, we see for very mature organizations, is over time, capturing an incident, monitoring and putting those metrics around it. The idea being that if I've been breached or I've had an incident of some type, have I learned from it, and can I make sure that I don't get impacted by that again? So often it's worthwhile to take the time to define the process, actually write this down, train people on it, make sure you have consistent methods being applied across a company, all following that organization security policy, with the idea being we understand what to do and who's responsible in an incident. Certainly like an emergency response plan, if there is something that happens, do people know who to call, who's going to act in what role, who can say what, who's authorized on behalf of a corporation should there be an issue? And has there been a physical process impact? Often you might have external media getting involved and people want to know what the company's doing about something. So anything like this can be certainly very noticeable, will draw a lot of attention. And the last thing you might want as a company there is having someone not authorized to speak on behalf addressing the media and news sources and so forth. The other part of the incident response is having enough data collected so that when you look back and you're trying to say, for instance, from a data breach, what was the original incursion? What happened? You know, can we track back to, did someone click on an email? Was there an IP address failure? Did we have a DNS server failure? What was the actual event that led to something that became an incident that we tracked and monitored? So forensic analysis, often we'll see what I've seen in mature organizations, an incident responder, people that are trained and have specialized tools to do data searches. And these days within the cyber world, it might be a cyber hunt team, someone that's actively looking for cyber threats across your organization and then trying to take effective preemptive actions before there would be some kind of issue of something that would happen. So, and that's that slide. Next.
So that kind of takes us to the end to the main portion of our webinar. So we first focused on really understanding what the current differences between the IT and OT teams are. We looked at some strategies and best practices for then aligning those groups and working on cybersecurity together. And then lastly, we focused on how to maximize the benefits of coordinating the IT and OT teams. So I saw a couple questions come up. If you have any more, now is a good time to ask them. We're just going to go through the closing slides real quick and then address all of the questions. So to look through in a little more detail on the different ways that exida can help with pragmatic cybersecurity, when we talk about our cybersecurity services, if we think about the IT and OT teams, holding cybersecurity workshops and either gap assessments to the IAC 62443 standard or to the ISO 27001 standard can be really helpful ways to get an understanding of what's currently going on in an organization and look at really where the most important places to put a focus on are. For certification, exida is an accredited certification body for IAC 62443 certification of not only security processes, whether it's the development process for a device or a system integrator process, also to provide device certification and system certification. In terms of references and tools that can help get get a deeper understanding of cybersecurity, as RJ mentioned, we do have the Implementing IAC 62443 book that, as an author, I believe is a very good reference, and it really does have a lot of useful information on how to take the standard and then apply it to a specific operating environment. We also have our Excellential Cyber tool that can support with risk assessment and security level verification, as well as a number of policy and procedure templates. In terms of training, we offer a wide variety of cybersecurity training courses that can really tailor to meet the needs of the specific cybersecurity objectives or goals for an organization, whether it's really just trying to get an initial introduction, understand about the cybersecurity lifecycle for operating plants, to look at cybersecurity in terms of device development, as well as contractors and integrators and a wide variety of other topics. Our personnel certification, so our CACE and CACS program, pair really nicely with these training courses. And so after going through the training courses and kind of developing a deeper understanding of the topics, these are a great way to kind of demonstrate the knowledge that you've gained and show why you're kind of ready for a cyber critical position and start to demonstrate that part that's being met for the organization. If you're interested in learning more about any of the topics in this webinar or related topics, please feel free to reach out to either me or RJ. Our emails are provided on the slides and will be emailed out. So please feel free to send us an email with any questions. We're always happy to get those and answer them. You can also follow exida on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to get the latest information, or check out exida Academy to see what upcoming training courses are available. So these are some courses that are coming up in the near future in the North America region, but there are courses all across the globe. We also offer self-paced online training courses as well. So really, whatever your training needs are, we're happy to help and look forward to working with you. So now to kind of get back and answer some of the questions that have come up. So the one question was, looking at really how safety and cybersecurity are related. And so in the latest versions of 62158 and IAC 62111, as well as 62443, they really are starting to tie these concepts closer together. And so then the question is going about kind of what does that mean, and also looking about, how to get that into policies and best practices. So what I'll do, I'll first speak to the requirements in IAC 62111, and then kind of talk about how they relate back to the 62158 requirements. So in the latest version of the IAC 61511, which is really focused for those end users, operators of the industrial facilities, there are two kind of key requirements that have been added in for cybersecurity. The first one is that cybersecurity risk assessments are now required as part of the assessment phase. So not only do you have to go through and do that process hazard, that risk assessment, you also have to go through and do a cybersecurity risk assessment to get an understanding of what the vulnerabilities are and how that could potentially influence the safety system. And so going through and completing that is now a mandatory part of the standard. And then also kind of in the design phase, documenting the results and how that affects the overall safety system is also required. So they're beginning to really tie that idea of safety and cybersecurity more closely together. And it's based on the realization that it doesn't matter how reliable a safety system is designed, if it could be easily hacked and compromised, you haven't really achieved that level of safety. And so that same concept is also what applies to the combination between IAC 61508 and 62443. So I believe it's specifically called out as kind of performing a vulnerability assessment and having an understanding of, what the potential cyber threats to that device are. And so I definitely will defer to some of my even more certification side colleagues at exida to provide a more in-depth answer. But kind of my understanding of it is that now performing that cybersecurity analysis, having an understanding of those potential vulnerabilities and potential issues, is now required for functional safety certification. Additionally, exida does offer 62443 certification, which really shows going above and beyond and meeting the specific requirements of that standard. And so kind of as the cybersecurity realm continues to develop, has to become more and more important for showing that those devices are robust and not susceptible to cyber attacks. So I think that calling that out is a really good point, and that relationship is really going to be very fundamental and is only going to continue to get more reinforced. Let's see. So another question that we're seeing kind of goes back to tying then two other standards together, and it's if OT is working on IAC 62443 and the IT team is trying to meet ISO 27001, how can you really coordinate that effort and try to have them be working together? And if there is a goal for then an overall security, policies and procedures for an organization, how do you go about doing that? And so one thing that we've seen done a couple of times and has been really successful is actually doing kind of two separate but coordinated gap assessments of the IT and OT cybersecurity. So doing a gap assessment based on ISO 27001 for IT, as well as doing one to IAC 62443 for the OT team. And so that allows the IT team to really put together the ISMS or Information Security Management System, and the OT team to put together the CSMS or Cybersecurity Management System. So the naming is a little bit different, but they kind of each go back to the core elements of those respective standards. And by going through and doing that and finding out the key areas to focus on for both groups, you can actually then align what the IT overall ISMS document requires with the cybersecurity management system. And so actually building in, a policy that not only meets both standards, but then has a clear communication between the IT and OT teams is a really effective way of trying to address those concerns and have an effective and coordinated approach to cybersecurity. So those are the two questions that I've seen pop up. If there are any other questions, please feel free to either ask them quickly now or to send them in an email to either myself or RJ, and we'll be happy to respond. And if no other questions pop up, thank you very much for your time and attending the webinar. It was a pleasure getting to present today, and I look forward to hearing additional questions. So please take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone.